I've been looking really forward to this panel because the people on it are so terrific, Ben Law, Fiona McGregor and William Yang. What I haven't been looking forward to or been nervous about is the discussion, because the subject I think is a really complicated one. As you know, it's been a good year for lesbians, as they said at the Oscars. If you call Natalie Portman's psycho-lesbian scenes positive, and whatever. You know, issues around identity aren't holding as fast as they did. When there was perceived, I think there was a perception there was more political motivation to identify as gay. And now I think it's seen as slightly unfashionable to kind of necessarily think about those things because, quote, we've come so far. And it's true, there've been, apparently last year there were 52 law reforms were passed. The fact that there were 52 reforms that needed to be made is alarming, were passed by the federal government to remove discrimination between heterosexual and same-sex couples and de facto relationships, social security, immigration issues. But, you know, there's marriage is an ongoing, you know, whether or not we have gay people have the right to get married is an ongoing drama. And what personally frustrates me the most is the kind of wedge politic of being gay. You know, you get up, you're having a muesli and suddenly you're being discussed on the radio because Tony Abbott or someone is kind of wanting to kind of get people to get very flustered about something that's not really relevant, is a kind of issue to one side when they're kind of trying to kind of move the debate away from climate change or other issues, and that gets really exhausting. But that said, on a personal level, I personally have an ambivalence about some of the identifications expected if you're a lesbian or queer or gay. And I had some sympathy with Helen Razor, who wrote, I think, in an article on January the 29th this year, and she's talking, I think, this Thursday at 1:45, I think, here doing the soapbox here at the Wheeler Centre. But she wrote, the consistent delivery of coming-out narratives and drag shows and paintings of mid-century housewives as seen for the queer community is self-defining. There are those of us, though, who see this act as self-defeating and a little bit lazy and possibly a little bit cheap. And certainly the kind of particular standard narratives of gay identity have never been my personal ones. I haven't got a dramatic coming out story. I started to live with a woman when I was 37. It wasn't a big deal. So, and there is a particularly kind of defining narrative, if you like, associated with gay politics. But all that said, there are still a lot of very serious concerns, and it's easy to become complacent. And I think if you had lived during the AIDS epidemic in the 80s, you would have had to really think through very carefully your feelings around these issues. And I particularly want to pay tribute to William Yang at this point. I think his photos of Mardi Gras during the height of the AIDS epidemic are an extraordinary chronicling of a subculture at a time of extraordinary crisis. And one of the pictures, I think it's actually in a book that I published of William's about 14 years ago, called Sadness, based on one of his slideshows. There's an amazing photo of Peter Tully dressed as a migraine, which is an amazing, wonderful piece of performance art, but, you know, painfully, you know, hard-won kind of piece of performance art. But more than 10,000 people have been diagnosed with AIDS. More than 7,000 people have died, and it's increasing. And I know that's not just a gay epidemic, but certainly in the 80s it was felt particularly as a gay epidemic. And it was very important at that time for the community to come together. So look, it gets really complicated, and I think we all have very complicated responses to it. I was talking to Michael Williams, who's the program manager here at the Wheeler Centre, about the fact I get very thrown by the fact my first novel, Geography, is considered to be some people think it a queer novel, and Michael said to me, well, there's so much cock in it that for a male reader it ends up being a bit like that, which was sort of why I was kind of never quite knew how to respond to those kind of perceptions of my work. And I know that Fiona certainly has written about those issues, and in fact in the December edition of Meange, and there's an essay which I think you wrote in the early 1990s called I'm Not a Lesbian, which addresses some of these and is still, I think, incredibly relevant. Now, our speakers tonight they're going to speak in order of age, without being too revealing. But I'll introduce them and then just let people just going to do a brief introduction to their work and maybe some of their thoughts on the subject. Then we'll open to a more general conversation. Now, I've already mentioned William's work, but he's a performance artist, a photographer, and he's had quite a few books published as well. His first book was Sydney Diary, which is my favourite, from 1984, where he just chronicled Sydney life. Sadness was first performed as a slideshow. That came out in 96. He's done a wonderful book on Patrick White. There was a book called Friends of Dorothy in 97. You haven't actually had a book out in the last few years, though, I don't think, have you?
I have, actually.
Oh,
There's one of my performance pieces, China, came out as a kind of little program book. Yes.
Well, William he started doing slide performance back in 1982. The first kind of formal show was in 89. I just really, before I kind of go on, I really wanted to actually pay tribute to William being here tonight. He's an extremely important artist. He's been chronicling the world, especially Sydney, for decades, and we're really honoured to have him. And I just wanted to give William a round of applause. Ben, who's going to be our first speaker, is he's a Brisbane-based freelance writer. I liked it when I was thinking about my feelings about Ben when I was going to introduce him. I actually, this might seem strange, but I thought he was the George Clooney of publishing, a man so charming that one cannot help but be, in your presence. He's a senior contributor to Frankie magazine, and his debut memoir, or debut book, non-fiction book, The Family Law, was published last year, came out with Black Ink. It's a really wonderful book. And I've been lucky enough to have some long conversations with Ben about the book he's working on at the moment, which is about looking at queerness throughout Asia and the kind of experience of people in Asia about kind of grappling with this issue of identity, which I think will make his talk particularly interesting. Fiona, who will be talking after Ben, she's a Sydney writer and artist. Like William, she has moved between the written word and performance art. I first came to her work as a novelist. In fact, Fiona has I like to think it's a privilege of being the first novel I ever published. That was Au Pair back in 1993. Since then, short story collection Suck My Toes, really wonderful novel, Chemical Palace in 2002. Her first book of non-fiction was Strange Museums, that was in 2008, and Indelible Ink came out last year, another really fabulous book. She's always been pretty well my favourite writer in Australia. But we're going to, I'm a big fan of your work, and I always have been. So anyway, we're going to start with Ben and then just move through, and then we'll talk more generally.
Okay. Thanks, Sophie. Hi, I'm Benjamin Law. You may know me from such labels as That Gay Asian Writer, or The Writer Who Writes About Being Gay and Asian, or Chinky, the Oriental Homo from the North, or Gaybo, the Little Chinaman Who Could. Now, I joke about this, not just because I'm extremely racist and homophobic, but because I've worn these labels, or ones similar to them, for most of my life. And rather than resent the fact, I've actually come to grow quite comfortable with the idea. I guess from an early age, we're all positioned to strongly identify with the traits that make us stand out and the things that set us apart from everyone else. So for me, I grew up in coastal Queensland in a school with very few other Asians, and that's how I was seen, and that's how I came to see myself, as that Asian guy. Later, in my late teens, I moved to Brisbane, and that's a city with a substantial Asian population, so I was more regarded as the gay guy in a sea of hetero people. And now that I'm here with you in Melbourne, a city with many gay people and many Asian people, I'm feeling very, very ordinary. Thank you, William. Before we got here tonight, Before we got here tonight, Sophie asked us over email whether our sexual identities informed our work as writers. Now, I can only speak as a non-fiction writer. When I'm not working on straightforward journalism or screenwriting, I'm usually writing in a more personal, first-person mode. My book, The Family Law, was all about growing up in my family, written from my perspective. And much of the stuff I write for the magazine Frankie, for instance, is about my own life too. And this life, my life, involves my partner, who happens to be another guy. And because I write about that and other queer issues, that often makes people see my work as queer, which of course is accurate, partly. Because I'm writing about myself, the answer to whether or not my sexual identity, my gayness, my raging animal homosexuality, informs my work is, of course, a resounding yes. It informs my writing as much as I imagine a writer's heterosexuality might inform theirs. The only difference is we don't see that writing as heterosexual writing. We don't see those authors as heterosexual authors. We forget that heterosexuality is a sexual orientation, just like we sometimes forget that Caucasian is a race. Now, because I write around and about race and sexuality, I've actually been confronted on Twitter and over email with this question, and it's a fair one. Benjamin Law, don't you ever get sick of writing about being gay and Asian? And if we're judging from tonight's proceedings, I guess the answer is not yet. My official response to that is, when I can start writing about my life as a white heterosexual person, I will. But until my magic gay genome can be reversed, or I undergo some drastic Jocelyn Wildenstein-esque cosmetic surgery to reverse my race or change me into white, I'm not really capable of writing from that perspective. If I'm writing from my perspective is in part queer. Now, these discussions that we're going to lead into tonight actually remind me of an infamous 1998 interview that was on TV between the Australian journalist Fiona and the American writer Toni Morrison. Does anyone know about this?
I saw it. It was
yeah, okay. I'm just going to condense what was said for brevity's sake. Fiona to Toni Morrison. You have, in your writing, certainly marginalised whites. Why are they of no particular interest to you? Toni Morrison. I was really interested in black readership. Fiona You don't think you will ever change and write books that incorporate white lives into them substantially? Toni Morrison. I have done. Fiona Substantially? Tense pause. Toni Morrison. You can't understand how powerfully racist that question is, can you? Because you can never ask a white author, when are you going to write about black people? Even the inquiry comes from a position of being in the centre and saying, is it ever possible that you will enter the mainstream? It is inconceivable that where I already am is mainstream. So, just like some readerships will only ever see Toni Morrison's body of work as black or African American writing, there are some readers who will only ever see queer writing as that, queer writing. And I imagine for some queer writers that can be frustrating. Personally, I consider myself pretty fortunate, actually. Mostly my book so far has been stocked in the memoir section, except for one book chain, which stocked the family law in the legal section, and is now currently in administration. But it has also ended up in specialist queer bookstores, especially in Sydney's Oxford Street. And I'm really genuinely proud to be stocked under queer, but I'm also relieved that this isn't the book's only home, because I think that would actually bother me. It would probably bother me for the same reason that Toni Morrison would be bothered if her work was exclusively shelved in an African American section, or how I imagine women writers would be bothered about having their novels exclusively shelved in the female writers section, which does exist in many bookshops. And it's not just about where the book is shelved either, it's also about how it's packaged. Lionel Shriver has written about the immense difficulties she's had battling some of her publishers who often insist on drenching her covers with soft focus and sweetness, and she is not that type of writer. So in the same way, if all books with queer content were packaged with a bright gay rainbow, or alternatively a big brown arsehole, I would imagine that this would put off a lot of potential readers. It would probably put me off. We don't want to cut ourselves off from any readerships, because as writers, whether we're producing fiction or memoir, what we're doing is quite similar. We're trying to access some universal truths through extremely specific stories. We're inviting readers to imagine what it's like to be someone else, and that person might be queer. Queer writers write for queer audiences, but they also write for everyone. At the same time, I do think that there's a place for the queer writing label. I worked in an independent bookshop in Brisbane for about 5 years, and we had 2 shelves dedicated to queer writing. One shelf was non-fiction, the other was fiction, and along with the porny, muscle-filled lookbooks and the queer/lesbian magazine Slit, which I can't imagine found a much broader audience than queer women and lesbians, we'd put Sarah Waters and Jeanette Winterson and David Sedaris and Michael Cunningham there too, at the same time making sure that they were stocked in general release. The amount of times I saw young or recently outed queer people go straight to the queer section, hungry for books that spoke to their experiences, confirmed to me that, yes, in some basic ways, labels are necessary and we shouldn't shirk away from them. Now, in the end, none of us really have much or, if any, control over how people see us or our work. If they choose to see my writing as gay, or just Asian Australian, or just Gen Y, which is probably perhaps the label I like the least, to be honest, it makes me sort of retchy, I can't do much about that. And I'm probably getting to the point where I don't actually care. So if people just know me as that gay writer, or that Asian writer, or Gaybo, the little Chinaman who could, I'm more than happy to wear that label, because sometimes I'll get an Asian Australian teenager write to me, or a young gay high schooler write to me saying that they identified with something I wrote because they accessed my work through those labels. And that makes me happy, and that makes me proud, and it makes me grateful and chuffed, or as an older generation would say, it makes me feel extremely gay.
Fiona.
I realise, just listening to Ben, how there's a lot of semantic issues here, just the words queer, gay, lesbian, how different they are to me, those words, than they are to you, and how queer is now coming into more mainstream use, whereas for me, queer was a more edgy word, and it's always the word I've identified with. I've never identified with the word lesbian, although I'm called that. Some of you have heard this a million times before, like this essay that I wrote 16 years ago for Meanjin, and the title was kind of, it was a bit tongue-in-cheek, because it's kind of like, obviously, women are my lovers most of the time, but I don't call myself a lesbian, and certainly in a literary context I don't. Queer is really my preferred word because it's a fluid sexuality, but also I really like the cultural and political connotations of queer. It's a bit edgy, it's a bit humorous, it's a bit kind of, it's referring to something beyond just a sexual preference. And listening to sort of Benjamin talk, it's moving more into the mainstream, but I don't think the mainstream has grasped it yet. I think they're still uneasy with it. And as well-meaning as people are, I think one of the most obvious examples of this was this article about me came out in the Herald for my latest book, and in the first paragraph, kind of the bold print semi-headline, it was Fiona McGregor has worked as this a mistress and a lesbian performance artist, and it was kind of like, had this kind of scandalous connotation. I was thinking, what's a lesbian performance artist? Is that hot lesbian doubles at Club X or something like? I don't know. Anyway, so. But the labels have been more enthusiastically adopted by people outside of a sexual minority community, I find, in general. So I've always just thought, look, I'm a writer, no descriptives by preference, and the writing, there's a kind of a writing, writing maxim here, that verbs are better than nouns, nouns are categorical, adjectives are superfluous. I'd rather say that I write than I'm a writer. So I don't write gay books, and I don't think I ever have, or lesbian books. And I find, William, it's good that we're going to do this by generations and age, because you're going to talk really differently about gay culture. You're probably more comfortable with just saying gay culture, partly because you're a man and also because you're older. And I find that I identify with gay culture unless it's pre-commercialisation, which is it's like an historical, ancestral thing for me. And things are a little bit too fluid and liminal to put a date on anything, but I kind of think the late 80s is when the pink dollar gains currency and gay culture becomes very self-conscious and airbrushed, homogenous, inward-looking, and very male-dominated, and men are in the positions of power just like they are in straight culture. But one thing, and I think this is really taboo in homosexual culture on both the male and the female side, is that part of it is a fear of the opposite sex, and I've never liked that or felt comfortable with that. And I do think that's in gay male culture and lesbian culture to a degree. So that's something that I've never wanted to really be very involved in. So I think of my third book, Chemical Palace, as being quite a queer book, and that book really reacts against this mainstream gay culture as much as it reacts against mainstream straight culture. And I kind of use the word straight in like an old beatnik sense, like, you know, there are straight gays and there are straight straights and there are bent straights and bent gays, and, you know, I've got a lot of bent straight friends that I like better than the straight gays, blah, blah, blah. Can you follow that? So I kind of, this kind of community that I have made a lot of work in and partied and lived in for a long time is reflected in Chemical Palace. And I guess it's queer, but it's not homosexually kind of, what's the word, exclusive or anything like that. And it still exists. I think it's much stronger in Sydney than in Melbourne, and certainly was stronger before than it is now. But it's, you know, the edge is gone, because as much as we don't want to think that we've got anything to do with this mainstream gay culture, the fact that there are more poofs on TV has some kind of wearing down of the boundaries that affect all of us. So that's my position, but how I'm presented or perceived, that's another question. Looking at my 5 different books, let's say, look at the main characters that drive them, and in terms of sexuality, they've been pretty different. And when they're hetero, like the first book, my sexuality is not mentioned, or like my latest book, my sexuality is not mentioned. And because I've had such a tiny readership until the latest book, there's a lot of people that have come in and read this 5th book, Indelible Ink, and I'm a new writer to them, and they'll assume that I'm heterosexual. And in fact, a lot of them will assume I'm a 50-something-year-old woman until they see me get up and talk. And but when the main characters of the books are queer, then my sexuality is spotlit and it's made an issue of. And when the books with queer main characters sell really badly, and the hetero ones sell well. So that's interesting. Like, gay might be passé to a lot of people, including probably to all of us, but this is the market reality. It's that queer books, especially if they're kind of really kinky queer, they just sell really badly. They're a death knell. And I think basically I just realised at my age, I just think I am really lucky to have survived as a person, to have lived through whatever disease or truck could have struck me down, and as a writer. And you do get to an age where you just you can finally be taken on your own terms. And there are lots of adjectives. So hopefully they won't latch on to that one. That's a bit idealistic, though. I think that, you know, Benjamin will point out non-white people will feel that this kind of labelling in a racial sense as well as a sexuality sense, and us white privileged people, we're not going to be confronted except on the sexuality thing. And the central position, the assumed thing, is white heterosexuality. So, you know, sexuality is central to my work, but it's kind of like community, family, friendship, death, sex. They're really things that I write about all the time, and sex is at the heart of any decent writer, going back to Sappho and Homer. So, you know, queers are still marginalised, any non-heterosexuals are. And, you know, I think that also, even if you're not, if you can and you can lead a really privileged life in Australia and in urban Australia as a gay or a lesbian, but the fact that gays and lesbians are being tortured, executed, and banned in other parts of the world sends a frisson through you at the very least. The fact that you can't kiss your girlfriend or your boyfriend in public without looking over your shoulder, certainly as a woman, well, as a man too, you're risking violence, but as a woman you get the perv factor as well. I think these things give you an opportunity. The good thing about them is that they give you an opportunity to not take things for granted and to then find ways of identifying and empathising with people who are not privileged and broadening your world and broadening your mind, and you can go further out in your writing as a consequence, and you can really it makes you resourceful, it makes you receptive to unorthodox ways of doing things because you have to yourself in your own life, to the hidden, to the imaginative, to the oblique. This is what it can do, but it doesn't always. It's not like being black or being a dyke is suddenly going to make you into a good writer, but it can offer you an opportunity for insights in the human condition beyond the easy path. I was thinking, I wanted to second what Ben said about this thing in bookshops. Is like, we're up here to talk about literature ostensibly, except there is this big book industry. And I did a panel with Graham Aiken the other day in Sydney. He's the guy at the bookshop in Sydney. And the book industry is really suffering worldwide. People here, if you're readers, you would have heard about Borders they're going bankrupt or something. Gay and lesbian bookshops are closing. Graham was reeling off names in New York and London and other parts of the world. They're closing. And the thing, I guess, that worries me about that is that I have a different feeling doing queer gigs. I've only done about 2 for Indelible Ink, and there's some widened. There's a wider space or something. I can say things like trans man porn in a room like this, and people aren't going to freak out. Basically, in a bookshop, you can have that, and that's a culturally really valid thing. And Slit magazine that you mentioned is a magazine that takes itself very seriously in terms of photographic shoots and articles, but it's going to have trans man porn in there if it can get it in there, and it's an important cultural thing. Now, what will happen to that stuff when the gay and lesbian queer bookshops shut down? Then they won't even survive at the back of readings, I don't think. They will re-enter a kind of scary, underground, nasty place. They might get banned. That's one thing that worries me. And it's important also for young people or people in a position who need to know that they've got a history and community and, they're trying to come out. So that's one instance in which the labels can be useful. One thing I wanted to refer to this Hollinghurst book that's in the question, just to finish off. I love The Line of Beauty. I think it's one of my favourite books of the last 10 years. I don't think it's the first gay novel by a long shot. I mean, come on, like Genet. But I think actually I'd call Genet quite queer, because the other way to look at queer is this unorthodox way that you can apply to a manner of writing, which Genet is. Anyway, I think of The Line of Beauty's success, it's not just because it's brilliant and brilliantly written, but I think because it's got this 1980s Thatcherite setting, the gay stuff is at a remove. And I just don't think that a gay novel set in a contemporary London would have done as well. And I think that Sarah Waters' historical settings, Jeanette Winterson's allegorical approach, removes it as well and helps them. And I think that Christos Tsiolkas' the vexed relationship to homosexuality, they're not celebrating it, they're always kind of suffering it, and that appeals to the anxiety that still exists in the mainstream. Anyway, just a couple of ideas I just wanted to throw in, that to finish off pretty much. Yeah.
I was actually thinking of Christos as you were talking, because I was on a panel with him at the Wood Writers' Festival, and he talked about trying to, with his next novel, trying to resist the temptation to write about mainly heterosexual characters because, well, the slaps sold so much better. Yeah. And that's obviously a very kind of, compelling for a writer to actually feel that they've got a really general audience, and he was having to kind of work hard not to let that affect the kind of writing he did.
Well, he sold Loaded and Dead Europe sold well enough.
Yeah, no, but the slaps...
Nothing like the slap,
Yeah.
of course. Yeah.
And another thing I was thinking of was the fact that there's been a bit of a debate around the Mardi Gras festival in Sydney, and there's some talk about whether or not they're going to lose money. And there was an article in Crikey, and one of the points it made was that it's the Liberal government were one of the people who are offering to kind of prop them up because it's such a money spinner, and that point where commerce, while there's a really important political history to Mardi Gras, that the overlay between commerce and politics has got incredibly blurry, and there's a lot less politics.
Let it go down, I say.
Yeah.
Seriously.
Now, William, you told me you hadn't had a chance to... Do you want me to ask you a couple of questions, or did you have a little kind of...
I've got set pieces I could just reel off.
Excellent. We feel very special.
The first one which is in sadness, but I do it at all my talks, so if you've heard it before, please suffer it again. When I was 6 years old, one of the kids at school called me Ching Chong Chinaman, born in a jar, christened in a teapot, ha ha ha. I had no idea what he was talking about, but I knew from his expression he was being horrible to me. So I went home to my mother and I said to her, "Mum, I'm not Chinese, am I?" And my mother looked at me very sternly and she said, "Yes, you are." Her tone was hard and it shocked me, and I knew in this moment that being Chinese was like some terrible curse, and I could not rely on my mother for help. Or my brother, who was 4 years older than me, very much more experienced in the world, he chimed in, "And you'd better get used to it." The second story occurred to me when I was about 16, attending high school in Cairns, which was the worst time of my life, because I wanted to be popular and fit in, but my hair would not brush back at the sides, and there was no way that I could look like Elvis Presley. One afternoon I was reading the newspaper, and I came across an article about homosexuality. The article described what the condition was, and it named 3 famous ones in history. And when I read that, I thought, oh God, there's a name for it. The shock of recognition rather hit me like a thunderbolt. But in Cairns, I thought that there were 4 homosexuals in the world: Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, Oscar Wilde, and me. So there were 2 incidents that really have kind of encapsulated and informed my life, and it still runs through it. It's this otherness. I came to Sydney in 1969, the same year as Stonewall, about which I'd never heard, and I was able to... I didn't bring my old case history. I'd lived in Brisbane. I didn't bring my old case history with me, so I was able to reinvent myself and come out as a gay man. I always say I never consciously came out as a gay man. I was swept out by events at the time. I was also trying to be a playwright, but I found it difficult to make a living as a playwright, so I started taking photos, and I found I could make a living as a freelance photographer. And so I photograph parties and events, portfolios, anything that anyone would pay me money for. And I survived, and then I started doing performance pieces, and I suppose that was talking with image projection and music, and that was a kind of formula that worked for me, and people wanted my performance pieces. Suddenly people overseas were wanting my performance pieces.
When was this?
This is in the late 80s that I started doing performance pieces, and just before that, the other important thing was I'd come out as a gay man in the early 70s, and about 12 years later I came out as a Chinese. That's the way I describe it, because the Chinese side of me had been denied and unacknowledged, and I'd suppressed it, and so it was very similar to coming out as gay. And I started to write about this, put all of these things in my story. And I suppose, although my form is not really, it's not really just writing, although that is a part of it. It's also visual and performative. But I'll just talk about it as my work, which embraces writing, which is a bit queer, isn't it? But so I suppose at that point, as an artist, I found that I found my voice, and that's written about very much in terms of all writers. You know, you find your own voice, and that was when I found my own voice. And also, it meant that I knew who I was. It was because my work is all tied up in my own story. It's autobiographical, and suddenly I found out what I wanted to write about, and it really was what made me different. And so from that point on, I've been consciously doing gay themes and themes about race. I've only got one life, and so my work tends to be a little bit repetitive, because I can't, like, as a fiction writer, I might be able to invent a new life, but I'm sort of stuck with the one I've got. And that's both my disadvantage and also my advantage, because it comes from something very real. It just comes from the same source that my voice comes from. So I've got to stick with that. Now, I've... But both themes progressed within my work. I'm always a gay person in my work, although there are degrees to watch. Sometimes it's a small proportion, and in one of my pieces, Friends of Dorothy, I'm 100% gay through the whole. The whole thing is totally gay, and. I'll just tell you this incident because it was about my fourth performance piece, and I've got a manager, Wendy Blacklock, and of course your manager always wants to see your new work, and they'd known that it was going to be a gay piece, and so they came up to it and they saw it and they were disappointed, and they said, "Oh, we thought it might have been a gay piece for straight people, but it's not." And I really can't work that out. I don't have a good enough relationship with Wendy to say, what did you mean by that? And I really can't work that out. How...
Explain.
What?
Were you meant to explain gayness?
I don't know what it was. Maybe there were too many. No sex. Is
no
that what
homosex.
No homosex. I don't know what it was, but I couldn't work that out. But my gayness, I'm always this gay character, and sometimes it's the gayness only comes in peripherally. And so my most successful, well, Sadness is actually my most successful book, and it was both the gay theme, which was about AIDS, so it's gay and death. So that's kind of sociably acceptable, I suppose. And it was about family and kind of a murder. So that's been my two. That's been easily my most successful piece. But I've kept on doing that, and people like my pieces about family, and so I can kind of do family, because that's universal, and be a gay character in that. What else?
You were talking about what I wanted to ask you about, which is the shift from your work seeming more around gay issues to now as much, if not more, on sort of the Asian identity issues. And I wondered if that was a conscious decision, or you just felt as you got older you were thinking more about your kind of your history, your family history, rather than your kind of sexuality. I kind of wondered what that shift was about.
I think that gay... Everything's very fashionable from my point of view of being older, or the senior person here in terms of age. That things go through fashion, and so it can be fashionable one minute and unfashionable the next, and the public attention span is very short, and it's kind of sensational as well. They want something new. This is the horrible part about our culture, is that they want to go on to the next new thing, and it's like the new thing before even the old thing has developed. Like, the greatest thing you can be is an emerging artist once you've emerged your yesterday's papers. But I think with the gay thing it was very relevant in the 70s and 80s, when there was legislation which made homosexual acts criminal, and that. And I suppose there's been nothing terribly pressing has come up after that, and even amongst its own community, it's lost its relevance a bit. But I always say that when I go to Mardi Gras, I'm very happy that Mardi Gras is still on and there's still that festival. Now it's more like performing the ritual. It's not a new thing. We're not discovering things. We're performing the ritual, and that's probably...
It's one of the questions, who you're performing it for, though. Are you performing it for straight people who want to prove on...
Like a religion, like we're just reinforcing our identity.
Yeah.
And
it's a ritual.
Yeah, it's a ritual. And look, we didn't realise that. We thought we were demonstrating in the streets, but it's a ritual we're performing. And I suppose with my own work, race, I still find, well, they've always been my themes, but I think that since I can't reinvent myself into a white, whatever it is, or a white heterosexual, then I'm stuck with my story, and I just have to find ways of reinventing myself or telling the story from a different angle.
One of the questions I had for everyone was whether they'd actually felt... Fiona talked about implicitly when she talked about sales of books with explicitly queer material, but experienced of homophobia as a result of their work in a kind of really explicit way. I'm thinking actually of an experience Ben Haddon wrote about when he was kind of attacked by a politician's wife during a signing, which is a fairly extraordinary thing to have happened. Well, it was sort of fun for us to watch, kind of, but what...
Well, that was a very specific situation where I'd given this speech about diversity in families over at the National Gallery of Victoria, and it was received very well, and I got quite drunk afterwards and quite happy, and then signed books, and there was a lot of goodwill and merriment. And then then a woman approached me, and she, a lot of the talk was about my background, being Chinese Australian, being gay, being from a family whose parents weren't together as well, and how it took many, many years throughout my teens to actually be okay with every single one of those things. So, of course, a lot of love afterwards, hooray. Signing books, and then get accosted by this woman I probably shouldn't say this out loud, but I actually thought, you know, when I worked at the bookstore, we had a lot of people with mental illness come through. And so when I saw her, I thought, she's lashing out at you, be kind. She was attacking me about my speech and saying, if I was your mother, you know, I'd be ashamed of you. And, you know, basically saying I was telling people to be proud to come from broken homes and to be homosexual. And I'm like, well, you don't have to be ashamed of either of those things. So that, and of course the punchline to that story, I didn't know who this woman was, and of course it turned out to be Margaret Andrews, the wife of Federal Minister, well, opposition Federal Minister for Families, Kevin Andrews. So that was nice, and that's probably been the only instance where I've had a hostile reaction, not necessarily to the book, but the things that I write about in the book and what the book is supposed to represent, which in part is about being queer or being gay as well.
So one of the issues actually is also internalised homophobia. That is, I think there's homophobia within the gay community as well. Have you had any particular experiences that are relevant?
Look, I think most of it, the way that it goes on these days is that it's silent, and there's so much kind of, in the book world, so much bourgeois politeness and so much that isn't said, and there's just a great disregard or a great discomfort. So I can't think off the top of my head of stories of somebody saying something explicitly homophobic, but certainly the level of sort of disregard or anxiety or it's there all the time. I think it's probably a little bit less than it used to be. I can't.
Well,
yeah.
Ironically,
but you know, because you were my publisher for some of the two more obviously queer books of mine, you could probably cast your mind back too to. I don't know,
Well, it was more, I was thinking of some of the discomfort around Suck My Toe. I think it was Suck My Toes, that on the one hand people wanted a lesbian writer to write about sex. On the other hand, then some of the criticism was, don't lesbians just settle down and have mortgages while they're all having sex all the time?
Yeah,
so there was kind of like, you were going to get it right, whatever artistic decisions you'd made, because people had come to the work thinking about sex and how you dealt with sex.
Yeah.
And that kind of focus on sex when you're a gay writer, that's actually what I find stressful. I was interviewed once on...
That's right. There was a critic who said, why can't we hear about lesbians with mortgages, you know, instead of all this awful kinky sex? It was like...
I want to read that.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, no.
That critic was actually a lesbian, so...
Yeah, no, that's right. I was thinking about internalised... I mean, the discomfort is not just from outside the community. Yeah. And when you're asked to talk about these things, people often actually want you to talk about sex. And I was interviewed once on Joy FM when I was the television columnist, one of the television columnists of The Age, and I got asked what television I like to have sex to, and I said if it's a really good show, I want to watch the television. And there was a kind of awkward pause at that point, because it's some things are private.
Yeah.
But,
I know. Look, actually, this is the way I sometimes feel about this whole question. Is it's just like, this is actually sex we're talking about. It's like, can you get away from my and just read the books and stop talking about my sexuality? It's none of your business. Sometimes I feel like that, you know, like, stop. Because I kind of feel like, okay, when you kind of start putting in the first paragraph about Peter Carey, heterosexual writer, or actually what would be more interesting if we have panels about sexuality, I'm not referring to this one because this is a queer one, but if we have them at your Sydney Writers' Festival or whatever, get everybody on there and ask the heterosexual writers, how does sexuality inform your work? Personally, as a punter, I'd be interested to hear that. I don't want to stop hearing about sexuality. I just want to hear about it in a more holistic way. Really.
One of the things that you mentioned, Fiona, and I know that Ben has been doing some work on, is that in a way we're privileged and we can have a conversation like this about whether or not the label works for us, because we are in a more kind of protected environment, and in some countries there's just not that possibility, where you're risking your life because of your choices. Can you briefly touch on some of your experiences when you've been researching your next book, Ben, about people's, say you were working, say, on drag queens in India, you might have a better example.
Sure. So the book that I'm writing at the moment, the working title is Geisha, and it's journalistic sort of insights. I've been travelling throughout the continent for the last 6 months, and I've got another 6 months to go. So I've been through Thailand, going backstage with the world's biggest transsexual beauty pageant, and in China looking at how the internet works for the gay community in an environment where the internet is heavily censored. Looking at Japan, which has a very... turn on the TV in Japan, it's really, really gay, but in a very certain aesthetic of gay. And the last place I just went to was India. And India is really interesting because it's the latest country. You know, we've got countries like Uganda that are looking to enact the death penalty on people who are gay or lesbian. In India, it's become the latest country to decriminalise homosexuality, and you've got this sort of, not exactly the same, but almost a 1960s, 70s Castro vibe in India at the moment, which is quite nice. I'm currently finishing off the chapter, or drafting the chapter about Japan, and what's interesting, it's a little removed from the literary discussion, but gay is really big in Japan at the moment on TV. So trends come and go, and they just apparently, I wasn't there for this, but apparently they just went through this massive fat craze. So if you were really massive and you had a big personality, you could probably get a TV career out of that. Now, if you're really mincingly camp, or a catty drag queen, or a sweet-talking transsexual woman, you could probably get a career in Japan on TV. And it's really interesting that that's probably a trend that will recede in a couple of years as well, and gay will just be swept away with another trend like fat or comedian lawyer, which was also a trend that they had for a while. You know, so it's just a movement for entertainment's sake. Yeah, that's what I'm writing about now.